amen. The book of Deuteronomy 31:6 says this, "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or tremble at them, for the Lord your God is the one who goes with you. He will not fail you or forsake you." And Moses in Deuteronomy surfaces really what I call a timeless problem that we have been wrestling with since the fall. And that is, it's the notion of loneliness, of isolation. It tells us in various reports that have come out over the course of the last several years that we are in the middle of a loneliness epidemic. Front page of the Wall Street Journal just this weekend. Yesterday I opened up and I see, the Kids for Children's Church are dismissed, by the way. I just get so excited about my message. I go into tunnel vision here. Wall Street Journal publishes an article just yesterday, front page of the newspaper, that there is a rash of loneliness among mothers who are in their mid to late 40s, early 50s. A demographic that has not been known or has not been cropping up on any of the stats. We find that seniors, 40% of seniors, according to the Health and Resources Service Commission, battle chronic loneliness. Cigna reports, an insurance company, not too long ago, 18 to 22-year-olds, 50% of them are struggling with loneliness. They find that if somebody is experiencing a chronic sense of loneliness, it's like smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Psychology Today reports that loneliness does not depend on the number of friends that you have. There's been studies done. More than 60% of lonely people are actually married. Loneliness actually makes us, they say, feel colder. So when it's 18 below out, and if you're struggling with loneliness, it may feel like it's 25 below. As far as I'm concerned, once it gets down below 10 degrees, it doesn't matter what the temperature is. It feels like your limbs are going to fall off, and that's just the way it is. Loneliness suppresses our immune system. They find that research has concluded that blood pressure will increase when somebody's lonely. Cholesterol will go up. The risk of cardiovascular disease also multiplies when we're in this state. It seems, based on all the different studies and surveys done, that just about every age group is going to struggle with this concept of loneliness. Whether you live in a rural community, whether you live in a city, whether you have a family around you, or whether you're a widow and you're home alone. It seems like this is just a chronic problem that we are facing. And we find it is timeless. Deuteronomy mentions it. When Moses says, he's concerned that God is not going to leave or forsake, they're struggling with this notion here of loneliness once again. And that raises the question, why are we so lonely? Especially with all the technology we have today. I mean, you think back in the biblical era, they didn't have a mail system, they didn't have telephones, they didn't have computers and internet, they didn't have Facebook, Twitter, and all these other different social media platforms. They didn't have any of that stuff, but yet there was still this problem of loneliness. And the question is, why do we have it? And I think there's three areas that we see loneliness crops from. One of it is circumstantial. Some of us are just in a situation that puts us in a place of isolation. It could be a job. You could be out on the road a lot. A trucker. I knew a guy, he was in sales, and he just was gone all day long. He'd just get in his car and he'd be driving all day, and then maybe come home. Maybe he'd have to spend some time on the road. It could be an illness. You could have some sort, we're right now, how many people have to quarantine? We're dealing with loneliness just based on the fact that we're in the middle of a pandemic. Parenting could be very lonely. If you're a stay-at-home mom or dad and you're with the kids all day long, that could just get kind of tiresome and weary, and that lack of human interaction and talking to somebody about other than Sesame Street, you're looking for some more intellectual stimulation there. It could get lonely. You could be in a leadership position. And that, again, leaves us in a state of loneliness. Just winter alone. When the temperatures are plummeting, who in the world wants to go out? Even my dog doesn't want to go out. I took him for a walk yesterday, and we went maybe not even a quarter mile, and he starts nudging me on the side of the leg, and he's looking, he wants to turn around, and that was with his blanket coat on him and everything. So we find circumstantially we have things that separate us and create a platform for loneliness. But it goes deeper than that. Loneliness could also be a personal issue. Now, let's face it, some of us have self-inflicted loneliness, and we don't always know how to get along. We say things that are inappropriate. We neglect friendships. We turn around and may make rude or disparaging remarks. And, the Bible tells us that as you give, so shall it be given unto you. And some of us give out a lot of grief, to be honest. And we've thrown up a lot of walls between us and the people around us because of our behavior. So we're often to blame for our loneliness. Sometimes it comes from persecution. If you're trying to follow Christ, there's going to be a level of loneliness that follows. Jesus said that if you're going to follow after me, people are going to hate you. They're going to throw you out of the synagogue. People are going to, at some point in time, going to kill believers thinking they're doing a service to God based on the fact that there's conviction that flows when somebody's trying to follow Christ. And just listen to what David said. This is back in the Old Testament era. David reflects upon this. He says, for my father and my mother have forsaken me. I mean, just think about that. Here you have David, one of these great men of God, and his folks kind of bailed on him, but he says, but the Lord will take me up. So we see that there's some self-inflicted loneliness, there's persecution that stems from it, but it goes even deeper than that. You have the circumstantial issues, which are often out of our control. We have the personal issues, which sometimes we can control, but we have a spiritual issue as well. That also creates this sense of loneliness. Now, very often when I've done sermons, I like to look at different languages, and normally it's Greek and Hebrew, maybe a little Latin. This morning we're going to look at a word from the Ute language. That's right. There's a language called the Ute language. It is a Native American language that was spoken by the indigenous folk out in the western plains and the Rockies. And that's where we get like Utah, the notion of the Ute. And the Ute had a word, and you're probably familiar with the word, but maybe not the meaning of it. And that Ute word that we're going to explore today is Comanche. We've probably heard the word Comanche. I think there's a vehicle out there that's called the Comanche, maybe. But the Ute used the word Comanche. And that means this: anyone who wants to fight with me all of the time. That's Comanche. Almost an enemy of everybody. Folks, that's us. James tells us this: you adulteresses, you do not know that friendship with the world is hostility toward God. Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy or a Comanche of God. How many of us have embraced the world and sinful practices, and because of that, we become, as Paul would say, enemies of the cross. By virtue of our sin nature, we're Comanches. By virtue of our separation from God, we are at enmity with Him. And I love what one of my professors once wrote. Tom Constable said this: Jesus did more than lay down His life for His friends. He died for His enemies. Because of our sin, we have this sense of separation, and that filters into everything we do. Who we are, how we speak, how we interface with one another. And that creates that sense of enmity. And that really brings us to our first point. And that is simply this: sin produces separation and loneliness, but God sees our need. And there's some hope here. So we bear in mind, we have circumstantial things, we have personal things, but most importantly, we have the spiritual enmity that has created this separation. But God has stepped into time and space. And this morning we're going to look at a passage, once again, the reading this morning from John's Gospel. We'll expand upon that right here. So what do we do about this loneliness issue? Jesus said this: "This is my commandment, that if you love one another, just as I have loved you, greater love has no one than this, that He laid down His life for His friends." And we start here with this exhortation to love. It's a common theme in the Bible. We see it scattered throughout the entire New Testament, and it is repeated over and over again, to go out and to love. And this is really the foundation. And this idea of love here, agape is the word used in Greek, and it's an unconditional commitment. It's not necessarily an affection, but it is more so of a decision, a willful decision to be committed to doing something and following through. We need to separate God's love from worldly love. And I think that's an important delineation that has to be made if we're going to ever find a solution to our loneliness issue. First off, that when we talk about love in an agape sense, in a Greek sense, in a biblical sense, it does not equate to emotionalism. We've got to be very, very careful about that. It's not a bunch of hype. It's not just this flashbang experience, this sudden burst of feeling that I have for someone or something. It's not also responsive to the fact that you treat me the way I want to be treated. It's not based on your performance. It's not driven by how others are interfacing with me and engaging me. It is not based on compatibility even. We can have a lot of things that aren't in common. I have a set of interests, you have interests, we all have different interests, we have hobbies, we have sports we like to follow, we have teams we root for, we have different books we like to read and internet websites we like to watch and movies we enjoy, and they're all different. And just because we are different in how we have these superficial pursuits does not mean that if we have this difference, I can't still love you. And that also applies to opinions about things, even in politics, yes. We can have differing views on a variety of things and still be able to love one another. And we see this here in the word agape. It goes beyond, or it transcends our belief system as it applies to worldly or superficial things. Love in a worldly sense also very often wraps around itself in the idea of tolerance. That's not necessarily what the scriptures are saying, that we suddenly just tolerate everything and everyone and all our sinful behaviors. That's not what love is about. We need to really take a good hard look. If we're going to put this idea into practice here, this command into practice, we need to understand from a theological standpoint, what does it mean truly to love? And Jesus says, well, first off, you got to love as I have loved you. We got to stop right there. Because when he says, you need to love as I have loved, now all of a sudden we have the paradigm, the model, the picture. And we see in the scriptures a definition of love being portrayed. And I just wanted to read it to you. Normally we look at Corinthians. That's the famous, love is patient, love is kind passage. I want to look at, just read and share with you a passage from Romans. Paul defines love in these terms. Just listen to what he says. Love must be first off sincere. Hate what is evil. Cling to what is good. Be devoted to one another in brotherly love. Honor one another above yourselves. Never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor, serving the Lord. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. Share with God's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Mourn with those who mourn. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. Do not be conceited. He goes on to say, do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everybody. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge, my friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, it is mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord. On the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. And in doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. A definition of agape we see here in Romans. We also find that agape needs to be empowered. I can't do this on my own. I can't love the unlovable. I can't interface and engage people that despise me and show compassion and mercy and grace to someone who doesn't like me. But we find in the Scriptures that the Spirit present in the lives of believers will give us the capacity to love the unlovable, to engage people who we find to be repulsive otherwise. And that is why the Bible tells us that the fruit of the Spirit, and you start at the top of the list, is love. So we have a definition of love, this unconditional commitment to show compassion and mercy to people. We find that it is empowered by the Spirit, and that it is exemplified by Christ when He goes to the cross. Because He tells us that greater love has no one than this, that He laid down His life for his friends. Now, when we think about Jesus making this sacrifice for you and for me, it brings us back to John chapter 10, verses 17. And he tells us this, "For this reason, the Father loves me because I lay down my life so that I may take it up again. No one has taken it away from me, but I lay it down on my own initiative. I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it up again. This commandment I received from my Father." Think about this for a moment. When we talk about the love of God and the sacrifice of Christ and his desire for us to have fellowship with him, that he did more than just run a risk when he came here. He willfully gave his life. Now, we live in a world where people will make sacrifices, some of them the ultimate sacrifice. They run all sorts of risks so that we can have quality of life. We have people in healthcare who run risks every day by caring for our needs and being exposed to illness. We have first responders who run into buildings, who go in and jump into rivers where their cars are submerged, and they run the risk, and some of them will pay a price to save lives. We read story after story of people who have been in fires and in accidents and all sorts of things, and folk make a tremendous risk, take a risk, to reach out and to rescue a human life, and they display compassion in doing so. Jesus did more than take a risk. He made a willful sacrifice. There was no risk involved. There wasn't some question about whether or not he was going to die. He came to die. He came to sacrifice. He came to offer himself in your place and in mine. And there's a powerful illustration of this that took place during World War II. There was a man by the name of Lieutenant John Robert Fox, who was with a company of soldiers that was invading Italy to free the Italians from German occupation. They'd pushed the German forces back out of a small town, and the Germans were regrouping, and the Americans had held this town, and they knew that there was going to be a counterattack. What they didn't realize was that the Germans were going to try to overwhelm them with a force that was much larger than their own. And as the Americans were in their position in this town, Lieutenant Fox was in a building a couple stories up, watching out over as the Germans were coming in around this village, and he was calling in artillery strikes to try to stop the German advance. They realized, the Americans, that they were going to be overrun, so they started to pull back from the town. Fox chose not to pull back. He stayed in that building, in that position there, calling in the artillery strikes. As the Germans came in and the Americans were retreating back into a safer spot in a position, he began to call in an artillery strike on his very position. His commanding officer responded back to him on the radio. He said, "Lieutenant Fox, you are asking me to bomb you. You are asking me to blow up your position." And he said, "That's correct, sir. There's more of them than there are of us. Send in the strike now." He willfully asked to be killed so that others may live. He wasn't taking a risk. He was giving himself up for his fellow soldiers. And he was killed in that strike. But because of his sacrifice, dozens upon dozens upon dozens of men were rescued because of that bombing. That's what Jesus did when he went to the cross. It was more than a risk. It was a sacrifice. A willful sacrifice where he was going to lay down his life in my behalf and on your behalf when he went to the cross. And that is why he says, "Greater love has no man than this, that he or she would lay down his life for his friends." That is an example of agape love. When we look at the definition, we look at the empowerment, we need to look at the example. And that is why it tells us in the book of Ephesians that husbands should love their wives like Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. That is a picture. That is a portrait. That is what we are called to do. And that is why we find here, our second point, is that sacrificial love turns a believer towards God. Notice here, if we love the way Jesus did, There is going to be an alignment that will occur in the believer's life with the God of the universe. I wanted to give you a picture here. Here's something you see all the time. It's a faucet. A simple faucet. We have them here in the church, you have them at home, you have spigots outside. Water in a faucet is what? It's under pressure. And that water will either come out or won't come out, depending on what you do with that little valve up there in the corner. The water's always there. It's always able to come out. And sometimes you have hot, cold, or sometimes you just have one. But here's the picture. That valve determines whether or not water is going to come into the sink or not. The human heart is often like a valve. And if we turn our hearts away from God, even though that love is there, even though that compassion is there, even though that mercy is there, even though that grace is there, even though that God wants to step into our lives and save us from sin, He wants to step into our lives and enable us to experience His goodness and a relationship with Himself. He wants these things. It's right there. It's ready to go. But if we don't turn that valve, if that heart, if that soul is directed in any other direction other than toward Him, what ends up happening is that we completely shut Him off out of our lives. And that's precisely what many of us do in the course of our day. If we do not have a heart that's open to God and willing to follow Him and to obey Him and to allow and embrace His commands to become part of who we are, what ends up happening is we just shut the valve off. And we never walk in that love that He has for us or let it flow through us the way He wants. When we begin to learn how to love, it is that's what turns that on. That's what allows that to flow through, because we're now aligning ourselves with Him and emptying ourselves of us. And this is the picture here of what Jesus does for all of us. So the reaction, if we learn to love, if we learn to be sacrificial, if we learn to put what Jesus did into practice in our daily lives for others, watch what happens. It tells us if we love God, He will what? Love us in return. We will realize the fullness of it. John 15:14. You are my friends if you what? Do what I command. Now notice here that word for friend. Not just followers, not just servants, but He uses the word friend. Important word to hang on to. In Greek it's philos. That's where we get the word Philadelphia from. A friend is someone you value. A friend is someone you have affection for. A friend is someone you have access to, you have intimacy with. A friend is someone who you place as a priority in your life. Years ago, the notion of friendship was a little unusual in the ancient times. We think of friends, and I think of like Facebook, or I think of, okay, there's somebody I know, yeah, we're friends, we hang out, we talk, or something like that. In ancient times, if you were a friend of a king, if you were the friend of a ruler or a monarch, if you had friendship with somebody, you would have access to that person whenever you wanted to. Above generals, above advisors, above officials. According to some historians, that a friend, if you were the friend of the king, you could actually walk right into the bedroom. You had this incredible sense of camaraderie and disclosure and intimacy. And this is exactly what Jesus is saying. If you learn to love, if you put this into practice, watch what happens. And I'm going to just walk with you through 3 scriptures here, right in John's Gospel. John 14:21. He who has my commandments and keeps them, this love business, is the one who loves me, and he who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him. And look at what it says at the very end. And I will what? Disclose myself to him. To be visible, to manifest, to appear. That when I put this command into practice, I'm going to begin to see the God of the universe. Watch what else he does. John 14:23. Same vein, same set of passages. Jesus answered and said to him, if anyone loves me, he will keep my word, And my Father will what? Love him, and we will come to him, and we will what? Make our abode with him. That word abode, mone is the word in Greek, to dwell with somebody, to be in their presence. That word is only used twice in the entire Bible. It's used in this passage and in John 14:2, where it says, in my Father's house there are many mansions. I'm going to go there and prepare a place for you. That same idea is being conveyed here, that we will have what? Fellowship. Relationship. Intimacy. Disclosure. Watch what he says when he wraps up John 15:15. No longer do I call you slaves, for the slave does not know what his master is doing, but I have called you what? Friends. For all things that I have heard from my Father, all things, hang on, all things I have heard from my Father, I have what? Made known to you. 3 passages in a short period of a short section of Scripture to disclose, to dwell, to declare, to discover. He's talking about intimacy here. He's talking about fellowship here. He's talking about a relationship whereby that deep human need that all of us have, this struggle with loneliness, is now going to be quenched. God's answer to loneliness is himself. That's the answer. It may seem super simple. Very often, and I've had this in some of my classes, the universal answer to any question that I ask is Jesus. Well, this is the universal answer to the most critical question that we are struggling with in today's day and age. When we wrestle with loneliness and this epidemic of loneliness and this separation and all this isolation and all these problems we're going through and like smoking 15 cigarettes a day and having cardiac issues and needing an extra blanket because we're so lonely and scared and wrestling with things, the answer is Jesus. That's simple. A relationship with him, a fellowship with him, a walk with him. And when that happens, the loneliness dissipates. If there's ever a person who probably would have experienced immense loneliness, it was a woman by the name of Amy Carmichael. She was born in 1867 over in Ireland. She was of Scottish descent. She grew up in a Christian home, chose not to get married, felt called to just be single. She had something called neuralgia. Some of you may even battle it yourself. It's pain in your nerves. It's a symptom of typically a greater issue. Sometimes it's very difficult to even identify. It can be very debilitating, and she struggled with this from the time of being a teenager. But she wanted to be a missionary. She wanted to go out and serve and get involved, but she had all these health problems. She didn't have a husband, she didn't have any kids. And she went out and tried to become a missionary and go to China. She trained for a while in London and then was going to sail to China and become involved with Hudson Taylor and the whole outreach to the Chinese people. And she gets on a boat and sails out there, and she's so sick they have to ship her back. She can't even go on a mission field for a while. She loses that opportunity. She eventually tries to sail back and ends up in India. And while she's in India trying to figure out what God wants for her, she discovers in southern India that there's a problem among children. In India they have a caste system. And if you're in a lower caste, you're looked upon as a deplorable. You're looked upon as a piece of dirt. They'll ignore you in the street even if you're starving to death. My brother was in India a couple of years ago. He said it's stunning to see the disparity between the rich and the poor. He says you could have a person with an estate worth millions upon millions of dollars, and next to them there could be a slum, and they'll literally walk over people in the street because if you're not of that same caste system, there's no value to your life. There's no, you're just a tool, an instrument. And as Amy Carmichael is in India praying and trying to discern God's will for her life, she discovers that they have these temples there. The year is 1901. And there's these temples, and there's these children, little girls, who are being sold in the temples as prostitutes. Parents, if they wanted to make a few extra bucks and didn't want an extra mouth to feed, would take their kids to the temples and just sell them. And there she discovered her ministry. to rescue these girls from these temples, from this life of prostitution. And one by one, the kids came running to her. They used to call her, in the Indian language, Amma, which means a mother who loves. She would care for them, shelter them, protect them, provide for them, teach them, raise them, give them a hope and a future because she valued them. And over the next 30 years, Amy Carmichael rescued perhaps over 1,000 children from temple prostitution. She set up an orphanage, the Nanavar Fellowship. It's still in existence today. There's still an orphanage in southern India that is taking in young children, both boys and girls at this point. But through her efforts, by 1948, they made prostitution for children illegal in India, temple prostitution. But what's unique about Amy Carmichael is that 30 years into her ministry, reaching out to these children, she fell. And she was bedbound for the next 20 years. She stayed in India, and she ministered from her bed. No husband, lots of pain, very little interaction with other people. And here you have this woman who is still loving upon a group of people, reaching out, showing them the compassion of Christ, showing them the grace of Christ, doing whatever she can through her writing, through her prayers, through her connections with the government, whatever she could possibly do to rescue children for Christ. And she's still serving until her dying day in 1951. And it was Amy Carmichael who once wrote, "You can give without loving, but you cannot love without giving." Did she wrestle with loneliness? Not sure. It says, "Bare heights of loneliness, a wilderness whose burning winds sweep over glowing sands, what are they to him? Even there, he can refresh us. Even there, he can renew us." Someone who's bedbound, someone who's living in a foreign country, someone who doesn't have a family, someone who is isolated because of pain and struggle and suffering. When someone writes a word like this, you know they have fellowship with God. It was Amy Carmichael who once said, "What is a missionary life?" Or somebody wrote her and asked, "What is missionary life like?" And her response was one sentence, and this is what it said: "Missionary life is simply a chance to die. An opportunity to lay down our life, to take up our cross, and to follow Jesus, and to put into practice the command that He has given us to love one another as He has loved us." My final point this morning is really quite this: God's people serve as the conduit of His comfort and His love. If you pour yourself into others, God pours Himself into you. That's the answer. That is the antidote. It's the emptying of self. It's the dying of self. It's being willing to be sacrificial and reaching out. And you could do it right now. You're saying to yourself, "Well, we've got COVID, and I haven't been able to get out, or I can't drive, or it's cold out, and it's 20 below, and we could come up with 1,000,001 excuses. All of us in this room, and I've done it myself many a time. There is somebody out there that you could reach out to. You could pray for, you could send a card to, you could make a telephone call, you could make a meal, you could visit with after church, you could take the time. There's always a way. It could be on the computer, you could use Facebook, Twitter, I don't care what means it is. We have resources now like never before to bring people together, and you could be that conduit, you could be that person to build into somebody else's life and use whatever resources you have. And you say, "I don't have a lot of resources." Well, guess what? Neither did Amy Carmichael, okay? The woman was laying in bed for most of her life. And if she's able to do something and make a difference like that and love on people in a culture that's very, very different from our own, then we could do the same here. I want to encourage you. You want to find that cure, that antidote for loneliness? Pour yourself in others, and God will pour Himself into you. Let's pray.